Welcome to Cosmo Talks, where every thought is a star and every conversation is a constellation. Ever get the feeling like something you're seeing isn't quite right? Like things are bigger or smaller than they should be, almost like, you've stepped into a funhouse mirror.
That quirky feeling is actually, it's at the heart of what we're exploring today. It's a real thing called Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, or AIWS for short.
AIWS, right?
Let's think of Alice's adventures. Shrinking down, growing huge, and you've sort of got a sense of what people with this condition sometimes experience.
Exactly. And it's not just about how things look, is it? Sometimes people with AIWS feel like parts of their own body have changed size. It's such a bizarre twist on, well, everyday perception.
It truly is. And to understand this fascinating syndrome better, we've gathered some really interesting pieces of information. We've got a broad overview, sort of looking at all the angles, a doctor story about a patient dealing with it, and even a peek inside the brain using imaging studies. So, quite a mix.
Okay, so what we're aiming to do today is figure out what might be causing these strange experiences, what it's actually like for people who have AIWS,
right?
And what our sources tell us is happening in the brain when reality gets a little bendy. We're after those surprising connections, those wow, I didn't know that moments.
Okay. And let's maybe start by looking at those Wonderland connections you mentioned. Lewis Carroll's stories are surprisingly relevant here.
Okay, yeah. So when Alice was falling down the rabbit hole, she felt like time was stretching out, right? Everything seemed to slow down. Isn't that something people with AIW sometimes report?
It is, yeah.
Right.
That distorted sense of time is a real symptom. And think about when Alice drank the Drink Me potion and suddenly shrank.
Right.
Or ate the cake and grew massive. That mirrors the AIWS experiences of things appearing much smaller than they are, which we call micropsia.
Micropsia.
Or much larger, which is macropsia.
And it wasn't just the world around her. Alice's own body changed size, too. That shrinking and growing feeling. That's like macrosomognosia and microsomognosia in AIWS.
Exactly. Where people feel like parts of their body are bigger or smaller than they actually are. Imagine waking up and feeling like your hands are just enormous.
Yeah. It's a bizarre sensation.
Totally. And remember Alice's moments of wondering, who in the world am I? That feeling of not quite being yourself, of being detached.
Oh, yeah.
That's similar to depersonalization, which can also occur with AIWS. It's almost like Carroll, stumbled upon a real neurological puzzle in his storytelling.
It's almost spooky how accurate some of those fictional moments seem now. Now, shifting from fiction to reality, our sources point to a surprisingly common connection with this strange syndrome, migraines.
That's right. Our overview highlights that migraines are the most frequent cause of AIWS in adults, and actually a significant factor for kids, too.
Oh, really? Kids, too?
Yeah. And the doctor's article gives us a close-up view through the story of a young person whose blurry vision came before headaches and was eventually diagnosed as migraine with AIWS aura.
And the numbers are pretty eye-opening, aren't they? The overview mentions that in people who get migraines or even just tension headaches, a large percentage, almost 80% in one study, reported seeing objects differently.
80%.
And over half felt changes in their body size. That's a huge overlap.
It is a really significant overlap.
Yeah.
And it's important to realize that AIWS can sometimes be a migraine aura, like a strange warning signal that a headache might be on its way.
Like a heads up, but a really weird one.
Exactly. The case in the doctor's article really shows this, where the weird visual stuff happened before the actual headache pain kicked in.
And this type of migraine, the kind that comes with these vivid aura symptoms like seeing things distorted, it seems to happen more often in children.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. Often starting around age 8, apparently, and sometimes it just disappears as they get older into adolescence.
That's an interesting pattern.
It is. But AIWS isn't just a migraine thing. Our overview expands the picture and points to other potential triggers too.
Okay, so what else could be behind these trips to Wonderland in our mind?
Well, infections are one possibility, especially Epstein-Barr virus, the one that causes mono. Also, if there's any kind of damage to the brain, what we call brain lesions, that has been linked to AIWS.
That makes sense. If something disrupts the normal workings of the brain, what else could be a factor?
Certain medicines can also play a role. Topiramate, which is used for migraines and epilepsy, is one.
Right.
And dextromethorphan, which is found in lots of cough syrups.
Oh, wow, even cough syrup.
Potentially, yeah. And interestingly, recreational drugs like LSD and marijuana have also been associated. And our overview also mentions psychiatric conditions and epilepsy as potential links. So it seems like AIWS can have quite a variety of roots.
It's like there's a specific way our brain processes information about size and space, and lots of different things can sort of throw a wrench in that process.
That seems to be the idea.
Now, what about the how? What's actually happening in the brain when someone experiences AIWS? This is where it gets really fascinating again. The neurology of it all.
Indeed. The brain imaging study, along with the clinical overview, gives us some clues here. What's interesting is that standard brain scans, like CTs and MRIs, they often don't show anything obviously wrong in people with AIWS.
Nothing structurally different.
Often not. It seems to be more about how different parts of the brain are communicating and functioning. More subtle.
So it's a more subtle issue of brain activity then.
Precisely. Both sources point to a specific area called the temporoparietal occipital carrefour, or TPOC for short.
TPOC. Okay.
Think of it as like a central hub. It's where information about what we see, where things are in space, and our sense of our own body all come together and get processed.
Right, sort of the brain's reality assembly point for that stuff.
Kinda, yeah. So if this TPOC gets a bit mixed up,
Then everything feels off.
exactly. If this area isn't functioning smoothly, it could explain why someone might misjudge the size and distance of objects, that's called dysmetropsia, and at the same time have a distorted sense of their own body. These often happen together in AIWS, which makes sense if this central hub is involved.
That makes sense. If the brain's main center for putting these senses together is having trouble. Now, the brain imaging study looked even closer, right? What did they discover there?
Yes, they did. They looked at how different brain regions talk to each other, what we call functional connectivity.
How connected they are.
Right. And people who get migraines and also experience AIWS, they found increased communication, increased connectivity between a visual processing area called V3. It's in the back of the brain.
Okay, V3.
And another area called the posterior part of the superior temporal sulcus, or STS.
STS, that sounds complicated.
It is a bit of a mouthful, but the STS is important because it's involved in bringing together information from different senses. Multisensory integration.
V3 and STS. Okay, so a visual area and a multisensory area are talking more than usual. Why? Why might that be important?
Well, V3 is thought to be involved in something called cortical spreading depression, or CSD.
CSD, that's the migraine aura thing, right?
That's believed to be the underlying cause of migraine auras, yes. And the posterior STS, as we said, is key for integrating different senses like sight and touch.
So the area involved in migraine auras is having extra chats with the area that combines our senses. Is that the idea?
That's basically the idea. Researchers think that this increased communication, this hyperconnectivity, might make the STS more susceptible to the disruptions caused by CSD during a migraine aura,
I see.
leading to those weird perceptual changes. It's a really interesting glimpse into how these strange experiences might actually arise from, well, altered brain activity and communication.
It really is. It paints a picture, doesn't it? How these bizarre sensations could be a result of how different parts of our brain are interacting, maybe a bit too much sometimes.
Exactly.
Now, beyond what might cause it and what's happening in the brain, what does it actually feel like to have AIWS? What kind of experiences do people report?
The range of experience is quite wide, as we see across our sources. The main ones involve visual distortions, like things looking too small or too big, micropsia and macropsia.
Right.
But it can also include things seeming much closer than they are. That's called palopsia.
Palopsia.
Or much further away, called teleopsia.
So your living room could suddenly feel like a giant warehouse with tiny furniture, or maybe everything could feel like it's right there, looming in your face.
Precisely. And it's not just about sight. People also report strange feelings about their own bodies, like their hands or feet feel enormous or tiny. This leads to a distorted sense of their own body image. And the feeling that time is slowing down is also common, as we mentioned with Alice.
And it must be quite unsettling, right? Feeling like the world around you isn't real, or like you're detached from your own body and thoughts. That sounds pretty disturbing.
It definitely can be. Our sources also mention other symptoms like changes in hearing and touch, sometimes feeling like you're floating or levitating, and even experiencing significant fear during these episodes. The story of the 34-year-old man, the one who had these sensations since childhood, and how they got worse after waking up and made him really anxious, that really highlights this. Even though he knew intellectually that it wasn't real, it was still incredibly distressing for him.
That's such a key point. They often know it's not real. That must be such a strange disconnect. But the fear of people thinking it's, a mental health issue. That probably makes it even harder to talk about and get help for.
Absolutely. That fear of being mislabeled, perhaps as psychotic, can be a real barrier for people experiencing AIWS. They might hesitate to even mention it to a doctor.
Yeah, I can understand that. So what's the usual outcome for someone with AIWS? Do these Wonderland-like episodes just keep happening forever?
Well, for many people, especially when it's linked to migraines, the outlook seems pretty good. Our overview mentions that with the right treatment to prevent migraines.
Like preventative medication.
Right. With that kind of therapy, the AIWS symptoms usually get better, often resolving over weeks or months.
That's encouraging.
It is. And generally, the sources suggest there aren't any lasting brain issues or neurological consequences unless the AIWS is connected to something more serious, like an infection of the brain, say from that Epstein-Barr virus we mentioned earlier.
Okay, so often it's temporary and treatable, which is good to know.
That's the general understanding, yes. However, it's important to remember that we still don't fully grasp AIWS. There aren't clear, universally agreed upon ways to diagnose it.
Right.
Which means it might actually be happening more often than we realize. It could be underdiagnosed. Researchers are definitely still working to understand this fascinating condition better.
Okay, let's wrap up our deep dive into Alice in Wonderland Syndrome then. What are the main things you think we should take away from all this research?
Well, first, I think is the fascinating way Lewis Carroll's fictional experiences really do align with the real symptoms of AIWS. It shows how our perception of size, time, and even our own bodies can be surprisingly distorted.
Yeah, the connection is amazing.
Second, the really strong link to migraines. How AIWS can often be a complex aura, particularly in kids, though in adults too. But also, it's important to remember those other potential causes, infections, medications, brain lesions, and so on. It's not just migraines.
Right, got it. And from a brain perspective?
From the brain perspective, we've learned about the potential role of that hub, the TPOC, in integrating senses. And also that increased communication between visual areas like V3 and multisensory areas like the STS in migraine-related AIWS.
So that heightened connection seems key, at least in the migraine cases.
Exactly. It suggests that AIWS and migraine sufferers might be due to changes in how these different brain regions interact. And while it's often temporary, AIWS gives us this really interesting look into how our brains construct our sense of reality and our own bodies, and how that construction can sometimes go a little, well, haywire.
It really does. So the next time you experience something that feels a little off in how you're seeing the world, maybe remember Alice's journey down the rabbit hole.
Right.
It reminds us that our everyday experience, which feels so solid and real, is actually this complex and sometimes surprisingly flexible creation of our incredible brains. What other hidden aspects of our perception might we be completely unaware of, just waiting for a little glitch to show them to us?